Let's talk about PlayStation. I personally don't have a ton of experience with them, and only recently started using one of their consoles frequently, and no, it wasn't the elusive PlayStation 5, it was a second-hand fat model PS3 I got for free, since I'm kind of weird like that. Despite this though, there is one PlayStation console I have a lot of experience with, and that's the PS1. We had one of these when I was a kid with a decent helping of games, and while we had a lot of classics to play, like Pac-Man World, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and the Tomb Raider games, whenever I picked up that PlayStation controller, my sights were set exclusively on Crash Bandicoot. Yeah, even though we had a lot of good games, I only ever fully committed myself to the two Crash games we had, those being Crash Bandicoot Warped and Crash Team Racing, and ever since I've been a big fan of the series. So with the 25th anniversary already past us, because I'm about as timely as a guy running an hour late to work, I hope you'll join me to take a look back at the original trilogy of Crash games on PS1, starting with the first. Before we start, I want to blow through development info. Most of this is stuff that any person who's a fan of Crash knows at this point, so we'll just run through it real quick. Before being a Bandicoot, Crash was known as Willy the Wombat, which apparently was always meant to be a temporary name. I'd wager it's because it sounds kind of dumb. There was also the fact that when the game was made, as a joke they'd sometimes refer to it as Sonic's Ass Game, because with 3D games the camera faces the character's ass, and because Sonic was the most popular animal video game mascot at the time. In the present day, Sonic's Ass Game has graduated from a game development term to video game genre. I just want to get past those because it's relatively well known. However, there were some other cool development things that I found from this book called the Crash Bandicoot Files. Picked up this thing in the Video Game Museum in Texas. I mean, you can just order it off Amazon, but that doesn't sound nearly as cool, does it? If you're a fan of Crash, though, I'd really recommend picking this thing up. It has a lot of scans of developmental papers when Crash 1 was being made, which shows some pretty interesting stuff. First off, Crash was supposed to have a radically different personality. Right now, we have this sort of dopey yet determined dude who kind of strikes me similarly to Wile E. Coyote, but before, apparently the Cortex Vortex wasn't a brainwashing deal, and instead forced Crash to watch random spews of media. So now when he comes out of the Vortex, he speaks in what the book calls bizarre non sequiturs, and I find it interesting to note that they spell non sequitur wrong. Fascinating. So now he randomly says shit from anything, be it pop culture, TV shows, movies, made-up commercials, or whatever. I imagine it being similar to Gex, except not charming at all, and just sort of really annoying and lame. You know what, actually, that might explain that one really awful and weird Crash 2 commercial, if they for some reason used Crash's personality from this.
And now, I have to do it again!
Kill me. There was also some scrap content too. There's the obvious ones of development plans for these waterfall and cave levels, which are pretty well known, although the cave does still mildly exist in the form of Boulder Dash's purple gem route. But also two, or should I say three, scrapped characters. First, Komodo and Kimono, which are prototype versions of the Komodo Bros, Joe and Mo, with their early designs being pretty similar to what they'd eventually become. There is also a scrapped Tasmanian tiger character that is very clearly Tiny Tiger, although unlike the Komodo Bros, he doesn't get a description of what his early personality would have been like, which is a bit sad. Thankfully, these guys would get their time to shine when Crash 2 rolls around, and I do intend on talking a bit more about this stuff when we do get to that game. Right now, though, it's just interesting to see how these concepts that we'd see in later games were being planned for a while. You know what, while we're talking about characters, let's talk about characters wait. I wrote in my script while we're talking about characters, let's talk more about characters. Wow, brilliant writing. While we're talking about scrapped characters, let's talk about the actual characters real quick. Crash is an iconic design showing the team's inspiration from Sonic and Taz from Looney Tunes, as well as having a lot of strength and simplicity. Cortex is another great one. It never always registers how he has a giant N on his head, cause it just kinda works for some reason. It's no wonder he cemented himself as one of the most recognizable scientists in gaming. Brio's also a good one, albeit more simple than Cortex. He isn't really around much in this game, but he really gets to shine in later games. I also think that the designs really shine concerning the bosses. Since the whole deal with Cortex is that he's making mutated animals, it only makes sense that you fight said mutants for your bosses. Ripperoo was always a really underrated one in my opinion, an extremely insane kangaroo who, when he isn't laughing maniacally, is trying to blow you up with giant TNT. Koala Kong is another relatively simple design, but I just find the visual of this super buff koala to be amusing, and plus, his boss arena was always one of the cooler ones in my opinion. But finally, we have Pinstripe, notable for having a fucking gun. Yeah, while all these other idiots are trying to get their hands dirty, Pinstripe's just gonna make sure he busts a cap in your ass, and yeah, his design is cool too, but it's kinda hard for that to be the main focus when he has a Tommy gun blocking it. Honestly, the only characters I don't feel much for are Papu and Tana. Papu's just kind of your average tribesman leaguer guy. He doesn't exactly leave an impression, but to be fair, he doesn't really get much of a chance considering his fight is the equivalent of battling 3 Goombas in a trench coat. Tana, meanwhile, is just kind of generic and doesn't really do much of anything. We'd have the same goal if Cortex was holding a giant stash of Wumpa Fruit hostage or something. That's about it though, so let's get into the story. We actually get to see Crash's creation here, being a mutated animal made by Dr. Neo Cortex and his assistant Embryo. After being mutated due to this Evolvo Ray thing Cortex made, Crash is set to be the general of Cortex's animal army. Unfortunately, Crash gets rejected by the Cortex Vortex machine intended to mind control him, and seeing as it's Crash, I'd assume it's for being too stupid. After running away and jumping out of a window like a dope, Cortex gets a female Bandicoot named Tana next up in line for the Cortex Vortex. It sounds wrong when I say it like that. So now Crash gets to go back to Cortex Castle to rescue Tana, cause, I don't know, they have a thing, I guess. It's never explicitly stated, but we can only assume. Yeah, that's all the story, and it's basically just a Mario story, but I don't need an insane story to enjoy a game, so that's fine by me. The game is also just as good at using simplicity to its advantage. You got 2 moves, a jump and the iconic spin, both of which can be used to deal with enemies. But come on, the spin feels so much more satisfying to get rid of enemies with. It might have to do with the sound design. Jumping on enemies has this quieter spring sound that plays when you bounce off multiple different objects in the game. Meanwhile, spinning has this sound effect that only plays when you spin an enemy. And on top of that, the sound effect just has this punch to it. It feels good. Throughout the stages is also a ton of crates, which are synonymous with Crash as a whole. Crates have varying amounts of Wumpa Fruit, which are basically the coins of this game, with 100 netting you a life. There's also TNT crates, where 1, 2, 3, there goes that life you just earned. Speaking of which, some crates have lives in them, and if you're really lucky, you can even find crates with an Aku Aku mask hiding inside. Aku Aku is a character that becomes a lot more important as the series goes onward, but in this game he's just sort of here, acting as a power-up and nothing else. The masks give you an extra hit point when you grab one, since Crash normally dies in 1 hit, and collecting 3 gives you a short bit of invincibility. That's the basic gist of things, although there is some extra stuff like these bonus rooms, where getting to the end has Tana just standing there for some reason, and this is how you save the game. Well, thankfully you can also save the game by collecting a gem at the end of the level, which isn't exactly something you just do. It requires a lot of effort, especially in this game, so why'd they think that was a good idea? Yeah, unfortunately this transitions into the more specific parts of gameplay, which also happens to be where many of my problems with this game start, to put it simply. So let's finish off the stuff I like first before we get around to that. Stuff like the graphics. I know that nowadays they aren't anything special, but for the time, they made great use of the hardware they had to work with and really got a lot out of it. This is also another well-known part of development. They make it so that the level loads around Crash as he moves through it, so that only the important bits are loaded in at any given time. This meant that they didn't need to worry if they could have the entire level loaded at once, and instead could just make sure that they could successfully load in each individual chunk of a level at once. It allowed them to put a lot of detail into these areas and helping making them feel like actual locations, which nicely leads into the variety of locations this game tackles. They gave a lot of varied areas to go through, going beyond what you'd expect out of traveling through an island. We of course have our standard jungles, but there's also rivers, giant walls, tribal villages while riding on the back of a pig, and that's just from the few in the first island. Later on, we get temple levels, taking place in both the interior and exterior, climbing up giant buildings, factories filled with toxic waste, and laboratories as well. I also think it's great how they managed to make the most out of the multiple reused level themes. For example, take the lab and generator room. Both share the level theme of very technological labs, and yet despite this, they both feel distinct from each other. I mean, they don't all do this, obviously. The river levels and Lost City levels feel relatively the same as each other, but the other 90% of the time they do get this down, which is admirable. They also manage to convey a surprising amount of ambience, mainly in the more intimidating levels. Crash being illuminated by the toxic waste when jumping over pits and Cortex power, the darkness of the Temple Ruin stages, the fog of the bridge levels, and the nice sunsets of the Lost City levels. One of the stages is named Sunset Vista. The sunset better look nice. I even imagine some of these locations could potentially intimidate younger players, especially in the more high-stress levels like Slippery Climb especially. Hell, some still weird me out even today. For some reason, the boss arenas for Pinstripe and Embryo still manage to make me feel uneasy, though I have no clue why. Maybe it's the low polygon models messing with me, something with the ambience, or maybe it's even the music. I know it's early for me to be talking about music, but this is in the category of stuff I like, and Crash games are really good about giving me good music. We have classics like the title theme and Insanity Beach, but there's also some other good ones like Toxic Waste, the River and Bridge levels, Slippery Climb, and the boss themes especially for me. As early as the first game, they also introduce the Crash instrument. You know the one I'm talking about, the kind of plongy instrument that's in a lot of Crash songs, and some of the most iconic ones especially. Is plongy even a word? I don't know, it is now. I think the instrument I'm thinking of is a marimba, but I wouldn't know because I'm musically inept. Anyway. The music also does a good job of actually raising the tension in stages. Ones like the themes for Slippery Climb, Generator Room, and the Temple Ruin levels are great at upping the anxiety, and it complements the more high-intensity platforming you'll be doing. The boss themes are also good at this, even if Pinstripe's boss theme sounds like someone's dying on the piano at parts. While later games do have stronger soundtracks in my opinion, I do think that Crash 1 was a very good first effort. Then there's also the, well, yeah, that's all the good stuff I got. This now emphatically leads us into the gameplay, where I start to get kinda mad. Let's start with the first problem that breaks everything, the giant domino at the start of the chain sparking all these problems, the control. Depending on whether you're on the ground or in the air, Crash is either more slippery than butter on a frying pan, or heavier than a fucking boulder. It is a near impossibility trying to get Crash to move directly backward during a jump, cause he does not like turning around in mid-air. It's as if I have a rope tied around Crash, and when I want him to move backward while in the air, I need to pull the rope as hard as I can, and maybe by some miracle of God, he'll go back and avoid death. Slipperiness is a much more self-explanatory issue. Crash holds onto his weight for dear life, and as such, that sometimes causes me to slip and trip off platforms when I'm just trying to slightly adjust my positioning. These two things in tandem make sure I rarely have confidence in my jumps. You know how in most platformers, 2D or 3D, you look at a jump and say, yeah, I can make that. Yeah, that doesn't happen in Crash 1. Even in the simplest of platforming, I would have to plan to make sure I'll land a jump successfully, because it feels like the game is specifically working against me, and as such, it isn't fun to control Crash in this game. For context, the only time I played Crash 1 before this was on an emulator many years ago, where I played the first few levels, said, this sucks, and then didn't touch it again. And as such, my first full playthrough of Crash 1 was on the Insane trilogy, so there was a lot of adjusting to be done. The first level was basically an introductory course on what to expect. I died 3 times here because I was incapable of clearing this bridge of boxes that I usually wouldn't even take a second glance at. 3 full times of dying at the bridge, going back to the start of the stage, and trying until I got it right. And the entirety of the first island was just me learning how to get to grips with these controls. Keep in mind, this was only the first island where the platforming is at its simplest, so as you can imagine, once I got to the second and third islands where the platforming becomes way more involved, it was a test of my patience just making it to the end. Don't get me wrong, I was able to adjust, and by the end of the game I could manage, but I still wouldn't describe it as a comfortable journey. But let's backtrack a second, because if you haven't played this game before, you might be saying, Hyper, why did you retry the entire first stage multiple times when you died at the bridge? The game gives you multiple checkpoints here, so why not just restart from them? Well, I'm glad you asked, because this leads us into the second major problem of this game, 100%. Now, please know, this is more of a personal problem, because most of the time, going for 100% in Crash games is my preferred experience. Crash games are fun enough on their own, but I think going for 100% makes them a lot more fun, fulfilling, and also just not as short. Which is why when the game kinda messes up the 100% experience, it acts as a bit of a big blow to this game. There is one main thing that ruins 100%, and that's how dying makes you lose out on the gem completely. Got to the end of the level and fell at the last pit, or hell, even behind the fucking goal, then exit to the map and go from the top. There are no mistakes allowed here. It's even more aggravating because the way it's framed makes it seem like a glitch or something. If you die and step on the exit portal, it just hard cuts to the loading screen for the map. I mean, if it at least told me, good job, numbnuts, you got all the boxes, but you died, no gem for you, then at least it'd feel a bit more reassuring, I guess, but how it just completely skips the box tally screen makes it feel unintentional. This especially sucks when levels go on forever or, God forbid, have backtracking. Sunset Vista isn't super difficult, but what makes it a problem is that it goes on for so long. So as you can imagine, I was positively fucking jubilant when I got to the end of the level and found out I missed out on 1 box. Are you kidding me? Then there's Cortex Power, the only level in the game that requires mass amounts of backtracking to get all the boxes, and the camera was clearly not made for this. It does a horrible job of showing you what's behind the camera, which makes running into those drone enemies an inevitability. I don't even know when it's like this. It does a perfectly fine job showing what's ahead when you're running towards the camera for the Boulder levels, but here it just does not want to cooperate. If you're expecting me to mention the bridge levels or slippery climb, then no, I actually found these to be fine. The bridge levels largely have you going straight, and the physics of this game are a lot more manageable when you don't have to worry about turning yourself, and can just run and jump in a straight line. The road to nowhere is a bit more of a hassle, just because the red gem route at the end requires you to make blind jumps, but that's really the only difficult part. Slippery Climb does have some really challenging platforming bits, but it wasn't that big of a deal. The worst part was jumping out of this window with boxes to get back onto the platforms. No, the 2 levels I got the most shit from were the Lost City and the Lab. Lost City has pretty much all the problems Sunset Vista has. I just think the obstacles were more challenging and I kept getting bumped off platforms by these lizards. The lab was so deceptively simple, but there's just so much working against you. This one scientist is always timed to kill me when I run across this bridge, and these slimes always jump in the most inconvenient positions. These levels are also pretty important, considering they're host to the colored gems. The colored gems are obtained the same way the other gems are in certain stages. They unlock certain routes in other stages that lead to more boxes that you can get more gems. I'm fine with colored gems, but in this game I think the way they're implemented ranges from annoying to underwhelming. A lot of the levels that need colored gems are placed near the start of the game, which means that certain gems are barred from you getting them until you proceed further through the game, which is really a general problem here. From what I remember, every colored gem was obtained after the level it's needed in, whereas in later games the opposite is true. You can get most, if not all, the colored gems before the level they're required. This reeks of padding to me. No matter what way you go about it, it forces backtracking. In one of the most egregious examples of this, we have the level Boulder Dash, which requires the purple gem from Lights Out, but getting the purple gem requires the yellow gem from the lab. So you have to wait until you get back from the lab, which is like one of the final levels, by the way, so you can backtrack to Lights Out for the purple gem, so you can backtrack to Boulder Dash for the normal gem. A backtrack for a backtrack? Really? Since you also collect the colored gems the same way you get all the other gems, that makes these things extremely underwhelming. In later games, there'd always be some kind of puzzle or alternate route you need to take, but here it's the same as the rest, which makes them both unsatisfying to collect and use. Maybe I'm hard to satisfy or expect too much out of a first game, but the first impression that colored gems give is that they're completely unnecessary and only there as a means of elongating the game. Look, I get it. Crash 1 was one of the first 3D platformers alongside Mario 64, and I respect it a great deal for that, but just because a game is important or warrants a great deal of respect does not exempt it from the very big and obvious problems I've pointed out. Likewise, being a first game also does not exempt it from one of my biggest problems with this game, that being the way saving works, which was done properly in Mario 64, which came out before, so that only proves the point. Just because I respect you doesn't necessarily mean I have to like you, you know? Oh yeah, I realized I never did go in depth on the whole saving issue. Basically, you can only save the game after playing a ton of bonus room or grabbing a gem. Imagine if the only way to save in Mario 64 was by getting a 100 coin star or beating a boss. That's what this is, pretty much. I also had one baffling instance where I collected the gem in Hog Wild, which saved the game, and so I decided to stop playing for the day. When I picked it back up later the next day, though, it put me a level or two back. I figured, okay, maybe I fucked up somehow. I'm only a few levels back, let's just get back to where I was. Well, for some reason, I got to Hog Wild again, and it saved that I got the gem, but not that I beat the level. What? Needless to say, this confused the hell out of me, and so I decided not to chance it and marathon the entire game after that experience to make sure I wouldn't have to deal with the saving again. I just feel like it's reasonable game design to not make the save system in such an obtuse and confusing way, because even if it did work, it's still being inconvenient since getting to a bonus stage, and especially grabbing a gem, are tasks that need to be completed, not something you just go and do like it ain't shit. It's really sad, because everything other than the gameplay here, I think was either really good or really impressive for the time. Unfortunately, though, at the end of the day, it is a video game, and if the gameplay isn't fun, then that's a big blow, and Crash 1 has so many fundamental problems with its structure and design that I do not think it is a fun game to play. It's part of why I decided to highlight the positives before tearing into this game, because I do think the good parts should be appreciated, but at the same time, most of what I have to say are complaints. I also think it's sad because when you look at it, a lot of these problems could easily be fixed. I mean, the backtracking issue is kind of baked in, but things like the no death requirement, bad physics, and the save mechanic could be resolved with some tweaking, and would make it an infinitely more enjoyable game. With that being said, our Bandicoot story obviously doesn't end here, as only a little over a year later, we get a sequel in the form of Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back. So I hope you'll join me for that next time. I hope you enjoyed the video, take care, and I will see you all later.